In this section, we're going to look at quadratic equations. Quadratic equations are in the form of y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are always real numbers, and a is not allowed to equal 0. A is always going to be the coefficient of the x squared, b is always the coefficient of the plane x, and c is going to be your plane constant. To solve factored equations, you're going to use the zero product property and set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So in the case of the first example, we have the quantity of 2x plus 1 times the quantity of 3x minus 5 equaling 0. We're going to set each factor, the 2x plus 1 equal to 0, and the 3x minus 5 equal to 0. Solving both equations, subtracting 1 from the first equation, both sides, dividing by 2, x is going to give us the answer of negative 1/2. On our second equation, we're going to add 5 to both sides, leaving us with 3x equals 5. When we divide both sides by 3, we'll get the answer of x equals 5/3. Now, most of the equations are not going to be factored for you. You will either have to factor or solve those. So let's look at a different type of equation. If we have 6x squared equals 36, in order to solve this equation and solve for x, we can divide both sides by 6 to start with. That's going to leave us with x squared will equal 6. To get rid of the x squared, we can take the square root of both sides, but we need to remember when we take the square root of both sides in an equation, you must put a plus or minus sign. So x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 6. Now the square root of 6 cannot be broken down. Its prime factors are 2 times 3, and we don't have two numbers that match. So two answers, the positive square root of 6 and the negative square root of 6. In our next example, 9x squared plus 18x equals 0. We can factor. Both terms have a 9x in common. So if we factor the 9x out, 9x times x will give me 9x squared, and 9x times a positive 2 will give me the positive 18x. Thus, since it's factored, if two numbers multiply together to give us 0, either the first number or the second number has to be 0. Solving the 9x equal to 0, divide both sides by 9, leaving us with x equals 0. On our second piece, all we have to do is subtract 2 from both sides, giving us the second answer of x equals negative 2. Now, equations are not always going to be able to factor. When you cannot factor, you must use the quadratic formula. Remember from intermediate algebra or high school algebra 2, the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all put over 2a. So if we're given an equation like 5x squared plus 3x equals 2, we first of all want to subtract 2 from both sides, leaving us with 5x squared plus 3x minus 2 equals 0. Only when one side equals 0 can we correctly read the a, the b, and the c. In this case, we're going to use the a for 5, the b is 3, and the c is negative 2. So if we plug that into the quadratic formula, x is going to equal the opposite of b, so the opposite of 3, plus or minus the square root of my b squared minus 4 times my a times my c, all put over 2 times my a. Cleaning that up, x is going to equal negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9. Look at your multiplication. Negative 4 times 5 is negative 20. Negative 20 times a negative 2 is going to be a positive 40. All put over 2 times 5, or 10. Cleaning up again, that's going to give me x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49, all over 10. Well, we all know that the square root of 49 is equal to 7, so I'm going to clean that up to negative 3 plus or minus 7 over 10. And at this point, I'm going to split the two answers. X is going to equal a negative 3 plus 7 over 10, and x is going to equal a negative 3 minus 7, all divided by 10. Negative 3 plus 7 is going to be a positive 4. 4 over 10 is the same as 2/5. Negative 3 minus 7 is going to be a negative 10. All divided by 10 will give me x equals a negative 1. This one would have factored if we would have worked a little harder in trying to factor it. Let's look at the last example we're going to do for this section. If 2x squared minus 5x equals 1, before we can factor or use the quadratic formula, we have to set one side equal to 0. In this case, this one will not factor. The a is going to be 2, our b will be negative 5, and our c is going to be a negative 1. Having to use the quadratic formula, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times the a times the c, all put over 2 times the a. Now cleaning up, the opposite of negative 5 is 5 plus or minus the square root. Negative 5 squared is 25. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8 times a negative 1 is a positive 8. All put over 4. Cleaning up underneath that radical, that's going to be 5 plus or minus the square root of 33, all divided by 4. The square root of 33 will not break down because if we look at its prime factors, 3 times 11, those will not factor any further. Therefore, we don't have two numbers matching. The square root of 33 is going to stand. So we have two answers. X equals 5 plus the square root of 33, all divided by 4, and x equals 5 minus the square root of 33, all divided by 4.